Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight we travel far into the past, to a quiet stretch of coastline along the eastern edge of North America. Long before the United States existed, before large cities and modern roads, this coastline was a place of dense forests, shifting sands, and isolated islands surrounded by the wide waters of the Atlantic Ocean. Our story begins in the late 16th century, during a time when European nations were exploring distant lands across the ocean. England was beginning to look toward the New World with growing interest. Expeditions were launched across the Atlantic with the hope of establishing new settlements that could provide resources, trade routes, and a permanent English presence on foreign shores. One of these early efforts led to the creation of a small settlement on Roanoke Island. Located along what is now the coast of North Carolina, the island was surrounded by waterways and marshlands that made travel difficult and communication slow. For the settlers who arrived there, life would require patience, cooperation, and resilience. The colony was led by the English governor John White, who oversaw the arrival of families hoping to begin new lives across the ocean. Among them were men, women, and children who believed they were helping establish England's first lasting settlement in North America. Yet the story of this colony would soon become one of the most enduring mysteries in early American history. When John White eventually returned to the island after a long and difficult journey back to England, he discovered something that would puzzle historians for centuries. The settlement was completely empty. Homes remained standing, but the people who had lived there had vanished. There were no signs of struggle, no clear explanation of what had happened, and no obvious trace of where the settlers had gone. Only one clue remained behind. Carved into a wooden post was a single word, Croatoan. Tonight, we will explore the story of the settlers who arrived on Roanoke Island, the challenges they faced in the unfamiliar landscape of the New World, and the mystery that began when the colony seemed to disappear without a clear trace. So settle in, allow the quiet rhythm of the night to slow your thoughts, and let the story begin as we step back into the distant year of 1587, and the strange disappearance of the Roanoke colony. In the late 16th century, England was beginning to look outward, toward lands beyond Europe. Nations such as Spain and Portugal had already established powerful empires across the Atlantic Ocean, gaining wealth and influence from their colonies in the Americas. English leaders believed that their country should also claim a place in this expanding world of exploration and settlement. Among those encouraging these efforts was the English nobleman Walter Raleigh. Raleigh received a royal charter from Elizabeth I granting permission to explore and establish settlements in parts of North America. The hope was to create English colonies that could serve as trading outposts and strategic bases along the Atlantic coast. During this time, the region that would later become the eastern United States was still largely unknown to Europeans. Maps were incomplete, and many coastal areas had only been briefly visited by earlier explorers. The land itself was inhabited by numerous indigenous communities who had lived there for generations, maintaining complex societies and deep knowledge of the landscape. In 1584, Raleigh sponsored an exploratory voyage to the coast of North America. English sailors traveled across the Atlantic and arrived along the Outer Banks region of what is now North Carolina. There they encountered the island that would soon become central to the mystery of the Roanoke colony. The explorers were impressed by the natural beauty of the region. They described dense forests, wide rivers, and fertile land that seemed suitable for settlement. The island they visited, Roanoke Island, appeared to offer a strategic location along the coast. Encouraged by these reports, Raleigh organized a larger expedition the following year. In 1585, a group of English settlers arrived on Roanoke Island with the intention of establishing a permanent presence in the New World. This early colony, however, struggled almost immediately. The settlers faced difficulties adjusting to the unfamiliar environment. Food supplies were limited, and the colonists depended heavily on assistance from nearby indigenous communities. Relations between the English settlers and local tribes sometimes became tense as misunderstandings grew. The colony eventually collapsed within a year. When English ships returned to the island, many of the settlers chose to abandon the attempt and return to England. The first effort to establish a permanent English colony in North America had ended unsuccessfully. Despite this failure, English leaders did not abandon their plans. Raleigh remained determined to establish a lasting settlement. He believed that with better preparation and a different group of settlers, a colony could succeed where the earlier attempt had failed. In 1587, a new expedition was organized. This time, the group included not only soldiers and explorers, but also families who intended to build a community in the New World. Their goal was not simply exploration, but the creation of a permanent settlement. These settlers would soon travel across the Atlantic Ocean toward Roanoke Island. What began as an ambitious plan to establish England's first lasting colony would eventually lead to one of the most enduring mysteries in early American history. In the spring of the year 1587, a group of English settlers prepared to cross the Atlantic Ocean in the hope of building a new life in North America. Unlike the earlier expedition that had consisted mostly of soldiers and explorers, this group included families, craftsmen, and laborers who intended to establish a lasting community in the New World. Leadership of the colony was placed in the hands of John White. White was not only an administrator, but also an artist and map-maker who had previously visited the region during earlier expeditions. His experience with the land and its coastal geography made him a natural choice to guide the settlers. The group of colonists included approximately 115 men, women, and children. Their presence marked a significant change in England's colonial strategy. Rather than establishing a temporary outpost, the expedition aimed to build a functioning settlement where families could live permanently. Crossing the Atlantic during the 16th century was a slow and uncertain journey. Ships depended entirely on wind and weather, and voyages could take several weeks or even months. Storms, rough seas, and limited supplies made such journeys physically demanding for passengers and crew alike. As the ships moved westward across the ocean, the settlers carried with them tools, seeds, and materials intended to help them begin constructing homes and farms once they arrived. They also carried hopes of opportunity and survival in a land that few Europeans had experienced firsthand. Eventually, the expedition reached the chain of barrier islands along the coast of what is now North Carolina. These islands formed a narrow strip of land separating the Atlantic Ocean from inland sounds and waterways. Among these islands was Roanoke Island, the same location where England's earlier colony had briefly existed. The settlers prepared to disembark and begin rebuilding the settlement that had been abandoned just 2 years earlier. For many members of the expedition, stepping onto the island marked the beginning of an uncertain future. The environment was unfamiliar, and the colony would need to rely on careful planning and cooperation in order to survive. Despite these challenges, the settlers believed they were participating in something historically important. Their mission was to establish the first permanent English community in North America, as they began constructing homes and organizing the settlement. Few could have imagined that this small colony would soon become one of the greatest historical mysteries in the story of early exploration. After arriving on Roanoke Island in the summer of 1587, the settlers began the careful process of rebuilding the colony that had been abandoned only 2 years earlier. The island offered access to nearby waterways and forests that could provide timber and food. Yet it also presented challenges unfamiliar to the English families who had crossed the Atlantic. Under the leadership of John White, the settlers began repairing structures left behind by the earlier expedition. These buildings had suffered damage during the time the island remained empty, and significant effort was required to restore them into usable homes. Life in the early colony depended heavily on cooperation among the settlers. Families worked together to build shelters, clear land, and establish small gardens where crops might grow in the coastal soil. The settlers had brought tools and supplies from England, but many essential resources still needed to be gathered locally. The island's environment differed greatly from what most of the colonists had known in England. The climate was warmer and more humid, and the coastal terrain included marshes, forests, and narrow waterways. Adapting to these conditions required patience and careful observation of the natural surroundings. Another important factor for the colony's survival involved relationships with the indigenous communities living in the surrounding region. The coastal area near Roanoke Island was inhabited by Native American tribes who had lived in the region for generations and possessed deep knowledge of the land. During earlier expeditions, contact between English explorers and local communities had produced both cooperation and tension. Trade and communication sometimes helped settlers obtain food or guidance about the unfamiliar environment. Yet misunderstandings could also arise between cultures with very different traditions and expectations. As the new group of settlers began rebuilding their lives, they hoped to create more stable relations with nearby communities. Successful cooperation could mean access to food sources and valuable information about the land. Despite these efforts, the colony still faced serious challenges. Supplies carried across the Atlantic were limited, and the settlers would eventually need additional resources from England in order to survive long term. During this time, the colony also witnessed an event that would later become a notable moment in early American history. In August of 1587, the granddaughter of John White was born on the island. The child, named Virginia Dare, became the first English child recorded as being born in North America. Her birth symbolized the settlers' hope that the colony might grow into a lasting English community. Yet even as the colony took its first steps toward permanence, the settlers faced the reality that their supplies were running dangerously low. Without additional support from England, the colony's future remained uncertain. This growing concern would soon lead Governor John White to make a difficult decision that would set the stage for one of the most mysterious disappearances in early colonial history. Life for the settlers on Roanoke Island quickly settled into a rhythm shaped by both opportunity and uncertainty. The colony had been founded with the hope of becoming England's first permanent settlement in North America, but the reality of daily life on the island proved far more challenging than many of the settlers had imagined. The small community consisted of families who had crossed the Atlantic together under the leadership of John White. Unlike earlier expeditions that were dominated by soldiers and explorers, this group included farmers, craftsmen, and children who intended to build homes and establish a functioning village. Each day required careful effort simply to maintain the settlement. Colonists spent their time repairing buildings, cutting timber from nearby forests, and preparing the land for small gardens that might eventually produce crops. The environment along the coast offered natural resources, yet using those resources effectively required experience that the settlers were still developing. Food remained one of the colony's greatest concerns. While the settlers had brought supplies from England, those provisions were never intended to last indefinitely. The colonists needed to learn how to hunt local animals, gather edible plants, and fish in nearby waters. Fishing in the surrounding sounds and rivers offered one potential source of food. The coastal waters were rich with marine life, yet unfamiliar fishing methods and changing weather conditions sometimes made this source unreliable. The settlers also relied on the land for game and wild foods. However, hunting in unfamiliar forests required knowledge of local wildlife patterns that the colonists were still learning. At times, interactions with nearby indigenous communities helped supplement the colony's limited food supply. Native groups in the region possessed extensive knowledge about the land and its seasonal resources. Trade or cooperation could provide valuable assistance for the settlers struggling to adapt. Yet these relationships were not always stable. Cultural differences, language barriers, and earlier conflicts between explorers and local communities had created tension in the region. Trust was fragile, and misunderstandings could easily develop. Meanwhile, the isolation of the colony created an additional challenge. Roanoke Island was separated from mainland settlements and from England by long distances that could not be easily crossed. Communication with the outside world depended entirely on ships arriving from across the Atlantic. As the months passed, it became increasingly clear that the settlement needed additional supplies and support if it was to survive. Tools, food, and new colonists would all be necessary to strengthen the community. For Governor John White, the situation created a difficult decision. Remaining with the colony meant sharing in the growing shortages of food and equipment. Yet leaving the island to seek help in England meant abandoning the settlers for an uncertain period of time. Eventually, White concluded that the only realistic option was to return to England and request assistance. The hope was that he would quickly secure ships and supplies before returning to Roanoke Island to support the struggling colony. None of the settlers could have known that this decision would lead to a long absence that would ultimately transform their small community into one of the greatest mysteries in early colonial history. By the late summer of 1587, it had become increasingly clear that the colony on Roanoke Island could not survive without additional support from England. Supplies were running low, tools were limited, and the settlers were still struggling to fully adapt to the unfamiliar coastal environment. The responsibility of addressing this crisis fell to the colony's governor, John White. White understood that the survival of the settlement depended on obtaining more food, equipment, and additional settlers who could strengthen the fragile community. However, the decision he faced was deeply difficult. If he remained on the island, the colony might continue weakening without the supplies it desperately needed. If he returned to England to seek help, the settlers would be left alone for an uncertain length of time. After discussing the situation with the colonists, the decision was made for White to travel back across the Atlantic and request assistance. The settlers hoped that the journey would be relatively short and that supply ships could return to Roanoke Island quickly. For White, the choice carried a personal cost. Among the settlers remaining on the island were members of his own family. His daughter, Eleanor Dare, lived in the colony along with her husband and their infant child. That child, Virginia Dare, had recently been born on the island and had already become a symbol of the colony's hope for a lasting future in the New World. Leaving the island meant leaving behind both his family and the community he had been entrusted to lead. Before departing, White and the settlers agreed on an important precaution. If the colonists were forced to leave the island before he returned, they would carve a message into a tree or wooden post to indicate where they had gone. This simple communication method reflected the uncertainty of life in the early colonies. Written messages carved into wood could remain visible for years, providing guidance to anyone returning to the site. With this plan in place, White boarded a ship and began the long journey back to England. The voyage across the Atlantic once again exposed travelers to the unpredictable winds and storms that shaped 16th century sea travel. When White finally reached England, however, events unfolded in ways that no one at the colony had anticipated. Instead of organizing an immediate return voyage, England soon found itself preparing for a major conflict that would affect the entire nation. Ships that might have been used to supply the struggling colony were suddenly needed for another purpose. The conflict between England and Spain was intensifying, and the country began focusing its resources on defense. As a result, White's efforts to organize a return expedition faced repeated delays. Months turned into years as the situation in England prevented ships from sailing back to Roanoke Island. For the settlers who remained behind on the island, this delay meant that the assistance they expected within months would not arrive for a very long time. And for John White, the growing delay would eventually lead to the moment when he returned to Roanoke Island and discovered that the entire colony had disappeared. When John White arrived back in England in the year 1587, his intention had been clear. He hoped to quickly organize ships carrying supplies and additional settlers and return to Roanoke Island as soon as possible. The colony depended on that assistance, and White believed the delay would be short. However, events unfolding in Europe soon disrupted these plans. England was facing growing tension with Spain, a powerful rival nation whose naval forces dominated much of the Atlantic world. The conflict between the two countries was escalating toward open war. In 1588, Spain launched a large naval fleet known as the Spanish Armada. The fleet sailed toward England with the goal of invading the country and restoring Catholic rule under Spanish influence. The threat posed by the Armada forced England to redirect nearly all available ships toward national defense. Vessels that might have been used to supply distant colonies were suddenly required for military service along the English coast. As a result, White found it nearly impossible to secure ships willing to sail across the Atlantic. Captains and sailors were being called into naval service, and the government prioritized protecting England from the approaching Spanish fleet. For the people of England, the events of that year were dramatic and uncertain. Ships gathered along the coast, soldiers prepared for the possibility of invasion, and the nation's attention shifted entirely toward the conflict with Spain. In the end, the Spanish Armada was defeated by the English Navy and a series of powerful storms that scattered the fleet. The victory became one of the most celebrated moments in English naval history. Yet even after the threat of invasion passed, conditions remained difficult for organizing voyages to distant colonies. Ships had been damaged, resources were limited, and England was still adjusting to the aftermath of the conflict. For John White, this meant that the return journey to Roanoke Island continued to be delayed. Each passing month increased the uncertainty surrounding the fate of the settlers he had left behind. White attempted several times to arrange passage back across the Atlantic, but opportunities remained scarce. When ships did become available, they were often focused on privateering voyages or other commercial missions, rather than colonial supply expeditions. Years passed before White was finally able to join a voyage, heading toward the North American coast. By the time he prepared to return, 3 full years had passed since he had left the colony on Roanoke Island. During those years, the settlers had received no assistance from England. The colony that had once hoped for quick support had been left entirely on its own. When White finally approached the shores of the island again, he carried both hope and anxiety. He expected that the settlers might have struggled, but survived. Instead, what he discovered would become one of the most puzzling moments in early colonial history. In the year 1590, 3 years after leaving the settlement behind, John White finally returned to the coast of North America. The long delay caused by war in Europe had kept him from reaching the colony sooner, and the journey back across the Atlantic had taken many difficult weeks. As the ships approached the Outer Banks region along the coast of present-day North Carolina, White must have carried a mixture of anticipation and concern. 3 years was far longer than he had ever intended to remain away from the colony he had helped establish on Roanoke Island. White knew that the settlers had been struggling with limited supplies when he departed. His hope was that they had managed to survive until his return, perhaps with assistance from nearby indigenous communities or through their own efforts to adapt to the land. When the ships finally anchored near the island, White and several members of the crew prepared to go ashore. The moment must have felt deeply personal to him, since his daughter and granddaughter were among those he had left behind. As they began exploring the settlement area, however, something immediately felt unusual. The colony appeared strangely quiet. There were no signs of people moving through the clearing where homes had once been built. White and the crew continued walking through the settlement, carefully examining the buildings and surrounding area. What they discovered was both puzzling and unsettling. The houses and structures built by the settlers were no longer standing in their original form. Instead, many of them had been carefully dismantled. Wooden beams and materials had been removed rather than destroyed. This detail suggested that the settlers had likely left the colony in an organized way, rather than fleeing suddenly in panic. There were no clear signs of violence, battle, or destruction that might indicate an attack. White and the crew searched the area for signs of where the settlers might have gone. They examined trees, posts, and other surfaces where messages might have been left behind. Eventually they noticed something carved into one of the wooden posts. It was a word that White immediately recognized. The word carved into the wood was Croatoan. This discovery brought both confusion and a small sense of reassurance. Before leaving the island 3 years earlier, White had asked the settlers to leave a message indicating their destination if they were forced to relocate. The word Croatoan referred to a nearby island known today as Hatteras Island. At the time, that island was associated with a Native American community known to the English settlers. White believed the settlers might have moved there in search of better conditions or stronger alliances. Yet despite this clue, the colonists themselves were nowhere to be found. The empty settlement on Roanoke Island marked the beginning of one of the most enduring mysteries in early colonial history. The people who had once lived there had vanished, leaving behind only scattered structures and a single carved word to hint at what might have happened. When John White and the returning crew carefully searched the abandoned settlement on Roanoke Island, the most important clue they discovered was the word carved into the wood, Croatoan. This single word would become one of the most famous clues in early American history. The carving appeared deliberate and clear, suggesting that it had been placed there intentionally as a message for anyone returning to the colony. Before leaving for England 3 years earlier, White had arranged a simple plan with the settlers. If the colony needed to relocate before he returned, they were instructed to carve the name of their destination somewhere visible. If the settlers had been forced to leave under danger or attack, they had also agreed to carve a cross symbol beside the message. Such a sign would indicate that they had departed under distress. When White examined the carving closely, he noticed that no cross had been added to the message. The absence of that symbol suggested that the settlers had not left in a state of panic or immediate danger. This detail offered a small sense of reassurance. It implied that the settlers may have moved voluntarily, rather than being driven away by violence or disaster. The word Croatoan referred to a nearby island located to the south of Roanoke. Today, that island is known as Hatteras Island. At the time, the island was inhabited by a Native American community who had interacted with English explorers during earlier expeditions. White already knew about this location because previous English voyagers had established friendly contact with the people living there. The Croatoan community had occasionally assisted English explorers with supplies and guidance about the region. Because of these earlier interactions, White believed the settlers may have moved to Croatoan Island seeking better support and safer conditions. If the colony on Roanoke had struggled with food shortages or conflict, relocating to a nearby Allied community might have been a logical decision. White wanted to immediately sail to the island and search for the missing settlers. If they had relocated there, he hoped to reunite with his family and confirm that the colony had survived. However, circumstances once again prevented the search from happening. Weather conditions along the coast suddenly worsened, and strong storms made navigation dangerous for the ships anchored nearby. The captains of the returning vessels became concerned that remaining in the area could risk damaging their ships or losing them entirely. As a result, they decided it would be safer to leave the region rather than attempt the journey to Croatoan Island. This decision meant that John White never reached the place where he believed the settlers might have gone. Instead, he was forced to return to England once again without discovering the fate of the colony. The carved word Croatoan remained the only clear clue left behind by the missing settlers. Over the centuries that followed, historians and researchers would continue examining that single message, hoping it might hold the key to solving one of the greatest mysteries in early colonial history. After the disappearance of the settlers from Roanoke Island, historians and researchers began developing theories about what might have happened to the colony. Because very little physical evidence remained, most explanations rely on historical records, environmental conditions, and the limited clues left behind. One of the earliest and most widely discussed possibilities is that the settlers simply relocated from the island. The carving of the word Croatoan suggested that they may have moved toward the nearby island now known as Hatteras Island. At the time, this island was home to a Native American community that had previously interacted with English explorers. Earlier expeditions had reported relatively friendly relations between the English and the people living there. Because of these earlier contacts, some historians believe the settlers may have chosen to join or live alongside the Croatoan community. Such cooperation could have offered food, shelter, and local knowledge that would help the struggling colony survive. Another theory suggests that the settlers may have moved inland toward other native communities or more fertile areas of land. Coastal islands, such as Roanoke, were vulnerable to storms and food shortages. So relocating to a more stable environment might have seemed like a practical solution. Historical accounts from later explorers have sometimes been interpreted as possible clues supporting this idea. Some English travelers reported encountering native groups who possessed European tools or spoke words that resembled English. These reports have led to speculation that some members of the Roanoke colony might have been absorbed into indigenous communities and gradually blended into the local population over time. A different theory suggests that conflict may have played a role in the disappearance. Relations between European settlers and indigenous groups were complex and sometimes tense during this period. If misunderstandings or disputes occurred, it is possible that violence might have affected the colony. However, historians have found little direct evidence supporting a large-scale attack on the settlement. Another possibility involves environmental hardship, food shortages, disease, and the difficulty of surviving in an unfamiliar landscape may have forced the settlers to scatter in smaller groups searching for resources. In the late 16th century, colonial survival depended heavily on stable food supplies and cooperation with nearby communities. Without reliable support from England, the settlers may have struggled to maintain their settlement. Because no clear records exist describing what happened after John White left the colony, historians continue examining these possibilities carefully. Each theory attempts to interpret the limited clues left behind by the settlers. The mystery of the Roanoke colony has endured for centuries, partly because none of these explanations can be proven with certainty. The settlers may have relocated peacefully, integrated with nearby communities, or faced hardships that forced them to abandon the settlement. What remains clear is that the disappearance of the colony created one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of early exploration in North America. For centuries after the disappearance of the settlers from Roanoke Island, historians and explorers continued searching for evidence that might reveal what happened to the colony. The mystery remained deeply compelling because it represented the first serious attempt by England to establish a permanent settlement in North America. Early investigations were limited by the tools available at the time. Historians relied mostly on written records, journals from explorers, and oral traditions passed down through local communities. These sources provided clues, but rarely offered definitive answers. As the field of archaeology developed in later centuries, researchers began examining the landscape more carefully. Archaeological teams started conducting systematic searches around Roanoke Island and nearby regions, hoping to uncover artifacts connected to the missing settlers. One area of particular interest was the island referenced in the carved message left behind by the colonists. Today known as Hatteras Island, this location had once been associated with the native community known as the Croatoan. Excavations conducted in parts of Hatteras Island have uncovered artifacts that appear to be connected to early English settlers. These objects include fragments of pottery, metal tools, and other materials that resemble items used by 16th century Europeans. Some researchers believe that these findings may support the idea that at least some members of the Roanoke colony relocated to the island and lived among the local indigenous population. If this occurred, the settlers may have gradually blended into the surrounding communities over time. Another interesting development emerged through the study of a map created by John White himself. White had drawn detailed maps of the region during earlier expeditions, and one of these maps contains markings that appear to have been altered. In recent years, researchers using modern imaging techniques discovered what appeared to be a hidden symbol beneath part of the map. Some scholars have interpreted this mark as possibly indicating the location of a small inland fort or settlement. This discovery led to additional archaeological investigations in parts of mainland North Carolina, where the hidden symbol might correspond to a real location. Researchers hoped that evidence of a secondary settlement might explain where some of the colonists relocated. Although these investigations have uncovered interesting clues, no single discovery has yet provided a complete explanation for the disappearance of the colony. The artifacts and findings suggest possibilities, but the full story remains uncertain. Modern archaeology continues exploring the region with improved technology, including ground scanning equipment and advanced dating methods. Each new discovery adds small pieces to the puzzle surrounding the lost colony. The search for answers has now lasted more than 400 years. While historians have developed several plausible explanations, the exact fate of the Roanoke settlers remains one of the most fascinating unsolved mysteries in early American history. More than 4 centuries have passed since the settlers of Roanoke Island vanished from the small colony they had worked so hard to build. Yet the mystery surrounding their disappearance continues to capture the imagination of historians, researchers, and curious readers around the world. Part of the fascination comes from the simplicity of the final clue left behind. A single word carved into wood, Croatoan, remains one of the most intriguing messages in early colonial history. That word alone has inspired countless discussions about where the settlers may have gone and what their final journey might have looked like. The mystery also represents a pivotal moment in the early history of English colonization in North America. The Roanoke settlement had been intended to become England's first lasting community in the New World. Instead, it became a story of disappearance and uncertainty. For historians, the event highlights the fragile nature of early colonial life. Settlers arriving in unfamiliar environments faced enormous challenges: food shortages, illness, difficult climates, and strained relationships with local communities could all threaten survival. In the case of Roanoke, the long absence of John White created a period of isolation that the small colony may not have been able to endure. Without supplies from England, the settlers would have been forced to make difficult choices about how to survive. Over time, the mystery has also become part of American folklore. Stories about the lost colony have appeared in books, documentaries, and historical discussions for generations. The idea of an entire community disappearing without a clear explanation naturally invites curiosity. Unlike many historical mysteries that involve a single individual or event, the Roanoke story involves more than 100 people whose fate remains uncertain. Men, women, and children arrived on the island hoping to begin new lives, yet their final destination remains unknown. Archaeologists and historians continue studying the region in search of additional clues. Artifacts discovered in nearby areas suggest that some settlers may have relocated and integrated with indigenous communities. If that interpretation proves correct, the story of Roanoke may not be one of sudden disappearance, but of gradual transformation. The settlers may have survived by adapting to the land and joining the societies already living there. Even with these possibilities, the mystery continues because no single discovery has fully explained what happened to the colony. Each new piece of evidence adds insight, but the complete story remains just beyond reach. Perhaps this uncertainty is why the Roanoke mystery still resonates today. It reminds us that even in well-documented historical periods, some stories remain unfinished. The past does not always leave clear answers behind. The settlers who arrived on Roanoke Island in 1587 hoped to create a lasting home in the New World. Instead, they left behind one of the most enduring mysteries in early colonial history. A quiet puzzle carved into the wood of a single word that continues to echo across the centuries. As our story slowly comes to a close tonight, the quiet shoreline of Roanoke Island returns to silence. The forests and waterways surrounding the island look much the same as they did centuries ago. When a small group of settlers arrived with hopes of building a new life across the ocean, the colony they created in 1587 was small, fragile, and filled with uncertainty. Yet it represented an important moment in the long history of exploration and migration that shaped the world we know today. When John White returned after 3 long years, he expected to find a struggling community waiting for supplies and assistance. Instead, he discovered an empty settlement and a single carved word left behind as a message. That word, Croatoan, has echoed through history ever since. For more than 400 years, historians have searched for answers about what happened to the settlers of Roanoke. Archaeologists have explored nearby islands and inland regions, uncovering small clues that suggest possible paths the colonists may have taken. Some believe the settlers relocated and eventually blended into nearby indigenous communities. Others believe hardship forced them to disperse in search of survival. Each possibility offers a different ending to the story, yet the truth may never be known with complete certainty. History sometimes leaves behind questions rather than clear conclusions. In the case of Roanoke, the silence of the island itself has preserved the mystery across generations. Perhaps the enduring fascination with this story comes from its quiet simplicity. A small colony, a long absence, and a message carved into wood that still invites curiosity centuries later. Tonight we have traveled back into the early days of exploration, following the journey of settlers who crossed the Atlantic in search of a new beginning. Their story remains one of the most intriguing chapters in the history of early North America. If you found this calm documentary relaxing or interesting, you are always welcome here. Subscribing to the channel and leaving a like helps support more long-form stories designed for quiet listening and peaceful reflection. Now the story fades back into the stillness of the coastal night. The wind moves softly across the waters. The forests stand quietly beneath the stars, and the mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke drifts gently into the calm rhythm of sleep.